Well, thank you for sitting down with me.
Thank you very much for having me here today.
I want to jump right in and start with this. You've talked both in your ads and in person at the debates a lot about how your willingness to support President Trump.
That's right.
You voted with him 62% of the time, for his nominees 77% of the time. How much do you worry, though, that that kind of message turns off the Democratic base?
Well, my base is the people of Indiana. I don't go to Washington as a Democrat or as a Republican. I go as our senator to do what's right for our state. And so when the president is right, I'm with him, like I have been 62% of the time on legislation, 77% of the time on judges. And whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, all you want is that the country move forward and do really well. And so, for instance, on right to try legislation, I was with the president. On opioids legislation, we actually have a piece of legislation on his desk right now that I think he'll sign this week. I'm hopeful he will. I have 4 pieces of legislation in that package. And so we work together on that as well. And if one of them that's in there is a process to get early approval for non-addictive opioid or non-addictive painkillers. And Eli Lilly is developing one of those right now. And so if we can help our patients, if we can help move our country forward, we work together, that's the best thing of all.
Notably, however, one of the votes you did not side with President Trump on was a very recent one that's generated a bit of attention, which is obviously Judge Kavanaugh. Talk to me about that decision-making process.
Sure.
As you thought, I mean, in the context of you were running for re-election, we're a month away as
right.
The vote was being taken
But
place.
even while I'm running for re-election, my first job is to do what's right for the people of Indiana and to do what's right for our country. As I said the other night at the debate, one of my heroes is Father Hesburgh, who was the president of Notre Dame when I was a student there. And he said, Joe, don't do what's easy, do what's right. And then that's what the people of Indiana expect. And so with Judge Kavanaugh, I use the same process that I've used every time when I look at judges, and in particular for Supreme Court justices. The same process I used when I voted for Justice Neil Gorsuch, President Trump's first pick, and one of only 3 Democrats to vote for Justice Gorsuch. And I took heat from the other direction on that vote. But what was important was that Justice Gorsuch, after reviewing all of the qualifications, clearly was a good fit for the court. And what I do is I interview the judge, I review all of their court decisions, I review any speeches they've given, watch their testimony before Congress as well. And then I want to make sure that they have the appropriate judicial temperament, impartiality, and high qualifications. And after all of that process, Justice Gorsuch was just a star in every way. And Judge Kavanaugh, when you saw his testimony before the committee and his conduct, I had very grave concerns about his impartiality and about his judicial temperament. So much that he realized and wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal talking about how he apologized for his conduct, that his emotions got away with him. In effect, that's what he said. And I thought, that's not a good fit for the court. And I was more than willing to work with President Trump to find someone else. There's a lot of very, very qualified people for the court who are just as qualified as Justice Gorsuch and would be a great fit.
When you talk about working for Hoosiers, though, do you think a majority of people in Indiana wanted Brett Kavanaugh on the court?
The exact number, I don't know one way or the other. Perhaps it leaned that way. But my job isn't just to be a fax machine. My job is to do what's right for our country while taking all of the information from our state as well. And so back in 2008, 2009, probably the majority of the folks in our state were against helping Chrysler, were against helping General Motors, were against moving forward with the auto rescue. But I voted for it anyhow because after all the research I had done, I knew it was the right thing for our state and I knew it was the right thing for our country. And so I was deeply involved in making sure we got that forward. And look at how that's turned out. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of jobs for our state. And what I tried to do was the right thing for our state and for our country. And that's what I've tried to do with Justice Kavanaugh, or Justice Kavanaugh now. And the other thing I want to say is I really hope he's a great justice. I want to support his efforts to be a good justice, to make the right decisions for our country. That's what we hope for, just as with President Trump, that I want him to be very, very successful, because when he is, the country's successful.
I can't think of too many Republicans in Indiana who've lost by railing against Obamacare. But that's what you're hoping Mike Braun does here, obviously. Are you concerned that Obamacare, even now, is still unpopular with Hoosiers, and therefore your position on it will be unpopular with Hoosiers?
Well, I think what you need to do is ask any family in our state who has someone with a pre-existing condition. And let's be honest about what a pre-existing condition is. It's a fancy term, but it's that kid on an IPS bus here in Indianapolis who has asthma and feels their chest getting a little tight and needs the inhaler. That inhaler is a pre-existing condition. And it is the young girl on a bus in Evansville who's heading to school and has arthritis and may be from a home with a single mom who makes $30,000 a year. And her medication costs $20,000. But she can get it because of the Affordable Care Act. That's why. Otherwise, she wouldn't be able to get that medication, and what would be happening is that child would be crippling up and someday would be in a wheelchair. And you know, when I have the choice of making a decision that allows a child to have an amazing, incredible life and to be healthy and to be strong, I'll make that decision every time. But here's the interesting thing about this, is Mike Braun has said he's for pre-existing conditions, even though he's clearly not. I mean, you can't trust him on this, as well as on a lot of other things. He said he was for pre-existing conditions coverage, but he supports a lawsuit that would take it away if the lawsuit is successful, and would also reimpose lifetime caps on cost of medication. He supported a Senate bill that would have taken away coverage for pre-existing conditions. And so your child who may have muscular dystrophy won't be able to get coverage anymore. And he supported a House bill the same way. And so he says one thing, but his actions show something completely different.
With some Republicans, and I think Mike Braun is included in this list, the message isn't solely repeal Obamacare. That's definitely the first prong of the message.
And as soon as you do,
right,
pre-existing conditions coverage goes away.
But part of the second prong, I think, of their message is replace Obamacare. And Mike Braun has said repeatedly that that replacement has to include pre-existing conditions.
And they've said this for 8 years, and they've not been able to pass a single piece of legislation. So if you're that child with arthritis, you would have been waiting at this point 8 years for that replacement. And by now, you might be in the wheelchair. And so I'm not willing to skip a day for that child who has asthma and needs an inhaler. I'm not willing to skip a day for that other person who has diabetes and needs their insulin. It's an empty promise that provides no coverage at the end of the day.
I want to talk a little bit about tariffs, because that's been obviously a huge topic here in Indiana. And again, that one's got to be a little bit difficult to find the balance, because there are Hoosiers who really like this idea of tariffs.
Right.
I think, of course, about the steelworkers, and others, particularly farmers, who really don't like how this is played out. How do you, as a policymaker, balance those two competing interests?
Because I don't believe they're intertwined. We can do two things at the same time. This situation with the steelworkers is not new. I've testified before the International Trade Court on a number of occasions on behalf of our steelworkers in Northwest Indiana. I'll have their back every time. But fixing that should not result in the next step being $200 billion of tariffs on our farmers. We have farmers all over our state who are harvesting right now. Prices Monday, just a couple days ago, were $7.90 cash price for beans, $3.25 cash price for corn. Corn break even, it depends on your yield, but it's somewhere around $4. For beans, somewhere around $9.20. So they're losing money on every bushel that they bring in. And they've done everything right, everything. Extraordinarily good business managers, run their farm in an incredibly successful way. And then they're faced with this. And so I'm on the Ag Committee. I've just written a farm bill that we're trying to get to the finish line. And I'll stand with my farmers every time, but it's really dangerous for them right now. And I met with the president personally. And this is what I said. What's important is, so Mr. Braun, Representative Braun, he said he'll just do whatever the president wants. He's going there to support the president. And I'll get back to tariffs in a second. But that's a fundamental misunderstanding of what this job is. I'm the United States Senator for the people of Indiana. I work only for the people of Evansville and Muncie and Fort Wayne. I don't work for President Trump. I didn't work for President Obama. I work with them, but I work for the people of Indiana. And Mr. Braun has said, I want to go there to vote with President Trump. Well, then that would preclude him from doing what I did a few months ago, where I sat with President Trump in his office, in the Oval Office, and said, Mr. President, look, these tariffs are a dagger aimed at the heart of our farmers because there's seed bills, there's mortgage payments, there's input bills for fertilizer and other things. And I said, all of those come due, and we're harvesting a crop now that costs us more to put in the ground than we're getting out. And he said, I think it's going great. I said, Mr. President, I assure you, for our farmers and for a lot of our manufacturers in our state, it's not. And I urged him to find an off-ramp. And I am hopeful we'll get there. I just saw in the paper this morning that he and President Xi of China will hopefully be meeting in a month or two to see if this can be worked out. But it's absolutely critical we get this done, because there are moms and dads sitting at kitchen tables around our state right now with the ledger book out that own farms and are looking and going, how are we going to be able to hold on to this next year?
Part of Mike Braun's message, though, is trust the president, trust the long-term plan. And we've seen some movement on, a new trade deal that the Senate will consider with Mexico and Canada. We've seen, and then to help offset some of that pain, the payments they plan to make through USDA to farmers, the $12 billion, I think. So isn't that bearing out what Mike Braun's message has been?
Well, I think it couldn't be bearing it out less, to be honest with you, because we've got farmers right now. So think of the situation the farmers are in. We are borrowing money from China to take that money to give to the farmers who were selling crops to China and getting the money directly. It's the most wrapped around the axle thing that you could possibly think of. Our farmers don't want aid. I'm glad they're getting it. I support it. I support those payments because they've been put in the middle of a ping pong battle, in effect, back and forth between the United States and China. And our farmers are the ones who have the target on their back. So I'm glad they're getting those payments. But they don't want payments. You know what they want? They want their markets back. One of the biggest fears in this is long-term damage to markets. Long-term damage to markets like the Chinese market, where they're starting to look at other places now, where they're looking in Africa, where they're looking in other countries to set up systems to grow soybeans and to grow them and get them from other people. I want to make sure our market is safe and gets stronger.
I want to ask specifically about that new Mexico-Canada trade deal. Was that something you will support?
I'm very hopeful too. I actually met, we talk about working together with President Trump. I met with the trade negotiators some months ago and laid out, I said, look, here's what we're looking for. Here's the things we need to get in this trade deal. And so I had significant input into the deal. I'm hopeful it works out. It's not all, not all the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted, but I'm hopeful it works out. And what we have to stop is making sure that we don't have any more carrier type deals, where these workers left, or the workers didn't leave. The workers unfortunately got fired by carrier. And I fought nonstop to prevent that. But where carrier, who is extremely profitable, who's doing very, very well, who had really extraordinary profits, very, very high quality, very, very high productivity, closed the plant anyhow to move it to Mexico. And the whole idea, what I told the negotiators was, I said, look, this is the hole we have to plug, that this kind of thing can't go on anymore.
That segues perfectly into my next question.
Great.
The idea of outsourcing has been obviously also a hot topic in this campaign. Is it hard to preach that message on outsourcing, though, when the company that your family runs, that you are no longer associated with, I will say that. You sold your stock, you haven't worked there for a long time. But
20 years.
Right, but a company you were at a time associated pretty closely with,
20 years ago.
But outsourced jobs to Mexico, does that undercut your message?
Absolutely not. So it's my brother's company, and I worked there 20 years ago. And they actually have more employees in Indiana now than they did last year or the year before. So they've added jobs. But let's look at the real deal here. Let's look at the real deal, which is Mike Braun. Mike Braun today, as we're sitting here in this studio, is making money off of creating and bringing in imported auto parts from China that used to be made in the United States. So as an hour from now, he'll have made even more money on those parts. And then he stood on a stage and said he had no idea where they came from, which was obviously baloney. And so you can't trust him on what he says or on how he's doing this. And so he should just say, look, I created and designed an entire line of Chinese auto parts. That's what he did. And that's what his business is.
And then I kind of want to finalize things. You talk repeatedly, both in this interview and obviously in your whole time in the Senate and even before that. You don't work for either party, you work for the people of Indiana. But the way elections work in this country is you will have that D next to your name on the ballot. In a state that is, I believe most people consider majority Republican,
sure.
How difficult is it to run as a Democrat on a statewide level?
They're also my friends. And they're also the people I work for. I'm the hired help. I work for them every single day. And so my job, we talked about before we came in here, I work for the people who get up in the dark and go home in the dark, who shower after work as opposed to showering before work. I'm going to be up in Northwest Indiana with the steel workers later on. I've been down with the coal miners down in Southwest Indiana just a few weeks ago and travel all over the state. And my job is to make it so that we can make paychecks bigger. Since I've been the United States Senator, every single month, 70 straight months, we've had increased job growth. Additionally, from end to end, we're increasing skills, we're increasing training, because what we want to do is have those paychecks get bigger. And we want people, when they see their family, to know, I can get a great house, I can send my kids to great schools, I can retire with dignity, I can have an amazing life. I already have an amazing life, I want our folks to say, and I can see that the plan is it'll stay that way. We're going to continue to grow jobs in our state. We're going to continue to grow jobs in this country. My work is to make it so that the paychecks get bigger and that every family can have more. And to make sure your health care is protected. That if you have someone with a pre-existing condition, if you have a dad or mom who's struggling with Alzheimer's, if you have a child who's struggling with sickle cell anemia, we're going to have coverage. If it's up to Mike Braun, that coverage goes away. But with Joe Donnelly as your senator, that coverage will be there every single day.
You did actually remind me of one other thing I want to ask about.
Sure.
I can't imagine it's a super popular position to vote against tax cuts for Hoosiers, but that's what you did in voting against the tax reform package. So how do you justify that vote to the average?
How do I justify it? So here's your example. So it would be like the parents going out on a shopping spree and giving the kids in the house the bill. No parent would ever do that. That's what this tax bill was. Let me give you I broke it down statewide. It would have been like the legislature of Indiana voting for a tax cut that would have put our state $40 billion in the red. There isn't a person in that building who would ever vote for that. And I'm not in the business of piling up huge debt for our kids in order to give huge tax breaks to the very, very richest people in our country. Mike Braun was for it because he was one of the guys, he walked away with a wheelbarrow full of cash out of that tax bill. He was one of the biggest beneficiaries because he's a multi-millionaire. I fight for average families, and I'm not going to give tax cuts to the very richest and stick the bill to our average families.
But if the average family saw a little bit of savings from that tax reform bill in the short term, do you think that message really resonates with them?
Absolutely, because I was glad that there was some increase for regular families. But here's the deal. The average was $37 to the very, very richest, to $1 for regular families. But guess what? Everybody who lived in our regular families paid the bill for the $37 that went to the richest. This was Mitch McConnell's tax bill. And when he was done with it, Paul Ryan gave away the game, the Speaker of the House. Because the day after the vote, he said, we've got huge deficits. Now we have to cut Social Security and Medicare to pay for it. I'm not cutting Social Security and Medicare. I'm going to fight against Mike Braun and Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell to protect Social Security and Medicare. We paid into that. We earned it. It is not an entitlement, as they call it. And so I'll fight for our families every day.
Thank you so much for sitting down with me.
Thank you very much.